Audio on demand from Vision Christian Media.
Foundations.
For the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable.
I want to point out there where he says, this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. God has not forsaken his covenant with them.
Foundations. Understanding the Jewish foundations of our Christian faith. With Robbo Robinson and Mandy Warby.
We're continuing a series on replacement theology, and in particular we've been focusing in the last few episodes on Paul's explanation of the Gentiles being grafted into the Commonwealth of Israel, the blessings and benefits we've inherited as a result of that grafting in. We finished last time by beginning to learn about the warnings that Paul gave to the Gentile church regarding their treatment of the Jewish people.
Yeah, and his warnings in Romans 11:11 were pretty stark and they were very blunt. We haven't heeded them very well, I've got to say, over the years. Because Paul actually said, he posed the question that have the Jews stumbled to the point of an irreversible fall? Have they fallen? And he said, may it never be. And then he went on to qualify why they've fallen in this temporary fashion. And he said that their transgression allowed for the salvation of the Gentiles to make them, that is, the Jewish people, jealous. So in their separation from the Gentile world, they've come to believe salvation to be for them alone. However, God wanted them to be, as we said before, a light to the nations, but they were keeping him a secret. By opening the gate for the Gentiles to come to faith in their Messiah, it should have provoked jealousy in them, causing a desire in them to also have what the Gentiles were now experiencing. But the Gentile church's unspeakably poor treatment of the Jews repelled the Jews. Instead, had the opposite effect. And there are more sober warnings by Paul to the Gentile believers regarding the Jewish people, and we need to be aware of those as well.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we read Romans 11:11 in the last episode. We're going to read quite a bit more of this chapter throughout this episode. So we're going to look at verses 13 and 14 first, where Paul said, I'm speaking to you who are Gentiles, inasmuch then as I'm an apostle of Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, if somehow I might move to jealousy my fellow countrymen and save some of them. So really he was saying he's ministering to Gentiles, but his heart was that it would provoke the Jews to actually come to faith as well.
And he wanted the witness and example of God liberating the Gentiles to be the very thing that provoked them. He wanted the Gentile Christians to be a witness. He wanted them to have a testimony.
Exactly.
Because Paul loved his Jewish countrymen. He was one of them. Remember, he was a super zealous religious Jew, a Pharisee of Pharisees, he called himself, and he was absolutely devoted to the law, determined to keep it pure, to keep it undefiled and untainted. He didn't realise that he was in error until, of course, he had his revelation of Jesus on the road to Damascus. And then he came to this stunning realisation that Jesus actually was the Messiah, and he wanted to reach Jews and Gentiles. And Paul understood the struggle that this was going to be for the Jews. The Gentiles had been their downfall repeatedly, and they thought that interactions with the Gentiles was going to displease God. So by engaging with the Gentiles, Paul knew that it was going to actually provoke them. It was going to get a really strong response, and it did.
Yeah. It
really did. But his ardent hope was that the response would be righteous jealousy, not unrighteous jealousy, for want of a better word. He wanted them to come to saving faith in the Messiah that they had been longing for centuries.
Well, let's continue reading through this chapter in Romans 11. So we'll read verses 15 to 18 now, where Paul said, if there, and this is talking about the Jews, if their being cast away is the reconciling of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? For if the first fruit, that's Jesus, is holy, and if the root, also Jesus, is holy, so are the branches, which is the Jews. And if some of the branches, Jews, were broken off, and you, the Gentiles, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, again, that's talking about the Jews, and with them, being a partaker of the root, that's Jesus, and fatness, life and blessing of the olive tree, don't be arrogant toward the branches, the Jews. But if you, Gentiles, are arrogant, remember that it's not you, the Gentiles, who support the root, Jesus, but the root supports you.
Now, this is a really important passage because it's laying out really clearly that the Jews are not just important, but they are pivotal to God's plan of salvation toward the Jewish world. However, the Gentile world isn't better and certainly hasn't replaced the Jews. The Jews still have a role to play. And let me tell you, it's going to be glorious when they all come to faith. But what is driven home in this passage is that both Jews and Gentiles, natural and wild olive branches, they are both absolutely dependent on Jesus, the root for both life and eternal security.
Yeah.
Without him, neither Jew nor Gentile can survive. I've got to tell you a story, confession time. I can remember many years ago in my church in Port Macquarie, and my church was a fantastic church and I loved it, and we'd often do stuff in the community. And I remember being really, really arrogant, so full of myself, thinking that my church was so much better than all the other churches, that we were freer, we had more life, we were more engaged in the community, our worship was better, you know, me. And then I got involved in Christian radio, non-denominational Christian radio, and God put me firmly in my place. And I realised just how arrogant I'd been and how very immature and very foolish I was in my judgment of other believers, because I worked with some of the most mature, most godly people from churches that I thought were less. And God put me in my place and taught me to stop being so arrogant.
Yeah, that's great. Well, that's the message that Paul was relaying to the Gentiles, who were running the risk of believing themselves to be superior to the Jews. You know, they were blinded to the reality and truth of Jesus, and therefore, you know, the Gentiles were sort of looking down their nose a bit, condemning the Jews because they could see and accept what the Jews couldn't.
Exactly. And so there's a really great passage where Paul went on to explain in Romans 11:25 to 29, again, continuing this warning to the Gentiles.
Yeah. Well, let me read that to you. This is Paul saying, I don't want you Gentiles, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved, just as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, he'll remove ungodliness from Jacob. This is my covenant with them, when I take away their sins. From the standpoint of the gospel, they, that's the Jews, are enemies for your sake, but from the standpoint of God's choice, they, the Jews, are beloved for the sake of the fathers, for the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable.
I want to point out there where he says, this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. God has not forsaken his covenant with them. And there's a couple of important points. We're going to tackle one of them now. We'll go on with about the gifts and callings of God being irrevocable next time. But I want to clear up a really brutal misconception. Paul said this, from the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. He wasn't saying that the Jews were the enemies of Christians. He was saying that from the standpoint of the gospel, they're enemies for your sake. So in other words, the Jews are enemies of the gospel because it's an offence to them. They don't understand it because they believe the gospel undermines the law of God. So the judicial blindness that God placed on the Jewish people makes it so difficult for them to comprehend or reconcile the law of God and the gospel of Jesus. And that's why they can't understand it. But in no way was Paul ever saying that the Jews are the enemies of the Christian believers. I mean, Gentile believers shouldn't be the enemies of the Jews, shouldn't be the enemies of anybody, not if we're Christians, we shouldn't
right.
be.
Yeah.
Paul taught that God wants us to come together as one new man, and you've read that numerous times in Ephesians 2.
That's right, yeah. So verses 12 and 16, we've read that in the last episode about this one unified man or one body in Christ.
Yeah, but can I throw a hypothetical at you? Let's just say hypothetically that the Jews are our enemies. Now, they're not, but let's just say, for the sake of this conversation, that the Jews are our enemies. How should we respond to them if they're our enemies?
Well, I mean, Jesus attacks this one pretty carefully in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5. He says, you've heard that it was said, you should love your neighbour and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you, so that you may prove yourselves to be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous.
So, Robbo, if a Christian truly believes the Jews are his enemies, then a Christian response is to obey the words of Jesus himself to love them, bless them and care for them. If they're not our enemies, then we should be standing side by side with them and loving them. We don't have to agree with everything that they do or say. And there are differences in our faith. If we're looking at Judaism, if we're talking about religious Jews, not Jews who believe in Jesus, yes, there are differences. But irrespective of that, we should be standing with them because it's from them, this commonwealth of Israel that we are grafted into. We're joining them. It's not the other way around.
Yep, so true. Well, we're going to continue looking at this grafting in, and particularly that the sense of the gifts and calling of God being irrevocable. We'll do that next time on Foundations.
This has been Foundations, a look at the Jewish foundations of our Christian faith. For study notes, resources and more, see vision.org.au/foundations.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.